welcome. We have with us Mauro Sullam and Carlotta Ridolfo, representing ULLARC, a collective of architectural professionals in Italy. It's an organization that was born out of conversations during the pandemic and announced themselves via a manifesto at the Triennale in Milan 2.5 years ago. And ULLARC is a collective actively pursuing better architectural workers' rights in the country of Italy. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass over to Mauro. And Mauro, what are some of the key moments of your journey as an architectural worker?
Hi, Rand. Well, I'm 40 years old. My journey as an architecture worker has been shaped by few key elements. First of all, I grew up in a cosmopolitan secular family that instilled in me a sense of social justice and concern for workers' rights. And thanks to my family's economic stability and thanks to robust public education support, I was able to pursue my studies without any financial burdens. And my university education, which spanned more or less 7 years, included also internships at smaller architecture firms. And during that time, I also participated in 2 faculty occupations, and those were experiences that were very important in fostering solidarity and critical reflection among my classmates. And well, immediately after graduating, I began working at a firm where I stayed more or less 2 years, and followed by 4 years as a doctoral student in architectural composition at the Polytechnic University of Milan, which is my town. And these year of PhD were very formative for my political development. In fact, I became deeply involved in queer trans feminist activism and also co-curated a conference and a book focused on architectural labor. And those moments significantly shaped my understanding of these problems, of these fields. And then from 2017 to 2022, I worked as, let's say, a precarious and underpaid professional in 4 practices, I think, and also as an independent professional. And meanwhile, I was continuing to teach as an assistant and also as a professor. And since like late 2022, alongside a more stable collaboration with a general contractor, I've been actively involved with ULLARC. And this allows me to leverage my experiences both as a worker and an activist to contribute to our collective goals.
Great. Thanks, Mauro. And same question to you, Carlotta.
Yeah, well, when I decided to study architecture, I actually didn't know anyone in the field, so I didn't know what to expect actually. And my family supported me, but for my study, I started working in other sectors. And I think this experience helped me to observe certain dynamics that even in the first years of university already seemed problematic. Deadlines required exhausting work shifts, often extending in weekends and nights. And for me, that I was already working, this was an additional challenge, and it was actually one that the professor didn't kindly look upon. Moreover, especially in design courses, students had to invest a significant amount of money to prepare for project review and exams. In general, free time was synonymous with a lack of commitment. Another aspect that made me particularly sensitive to this issue was my constant questioning of the social role of the profession. I had the opportunity to explore these reflections further through a master program that was more focused on these topics. And this taught me to never stop at the surface, not only in terms of the final outcome of a project, but more importantly, in understanding the entire process behind it. So when the time came to enter the job market, I quickly realized that actually university had not prepared me enough for what was ahead. I had no idea, for example, that the only way to establish working relationships with architecture firms was to open a VAT number. So working as a freelancer, despite being actually in a subordinate position. So it was during this period, while searching for someone who could explain how things really work in the industry, that I found like-minded colleagues online. And not long after, we founded ULLARC together.
Well, you've already answered a bit of the second question for us, Carlotta, but I wonder if you could expand on some of the problems that you engage with that you or other architectural workers around you face.
Yeah, well, I think that one of the most defining aspects of the architectural profession is its variety, both in the skills that are required and also in the different professional contexts in which architects operate. There are multiple ways to practice the profession. Some work full-time in a studio, some practice as freelancers, some own their own firms or work in construction companies or, I don't know, the public sector and in academia. So the diversification on one hand has led to an increasing expectation of wide skill sets, but on the other, I think it has progressively decreased the social recognition and the value of architect's role. I think this is a clear contradiction. On one side, we are expected to be able to do everything, but on the other, our work is at risk of becoming less and less valued. And in Italy in particular, this phenomenon worsened with the 2008 economic crisis and with the liberalization of the market and the abolition of minimum professional fees, all of which contributed to the valuation of the profession. And the consequences include underpaid work condition, exploitation, and increasing physiological pressure. So work ends up permitting every aspect of life with unrealistic deadlines, low-cost assignments, and in some cases, actually outright exploitation. So in Italy, as I was saying, moreover, regulation allowing the use of a VAT number with a single client have enabled architecture firms, even the larger ones, to organize work without contracts, so without protections or guarantees, but in fact in a state of subordination where fixed workplaces are set and working hours and fees are dictated by the client. So I think given the social and environmental challenges that lay ahead, I believe it is essential for all architects to reflect on what it truly means to practice sustainable architecture today, not just in environmental terms, but also in relation to the rights of professional and working conditions, which are too often overlooked.
Thank you. Before we move on to Mauro, there's a couple of things that you mentioned that I'd like to unpack a little bit. One is the freelancing of architectural workers in Italy, and the other is this idea of a minimum fee that it sounds like went away during the 2008 economic crisis. Can you talk about how both of those interact with each other?
Yeah, well, actually, we are now talking about taking back this minimum of professional fees. I think this is one of the reasons why we started to have low-cost assignments more and more. And also this condition of the, as I was saying, the VAT number permits also the studio and the firms not to pay enough the workers. So this is like a condition that gives a burnout situation, because it allows the firms, even the large ones, to have many people in the studio because they are allowed to pay them very few money. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. We in the US, we used to have a minimum architectural fee nationwide set up, and it was done away with in the 1970s. So we've been operating without that minimum fee for a long time. So Mauro, I'll ask you the same question. What are a few key problems that you engage with in the architectural profession.
Okay. Well, let me say that we all make political choices daily, even where we are not aware of it. How we behave with others, what we buy and sell, the words we use to express ourselves, what we design. Every action excludes other possible actions and determines some consequences. And I consider our political activity and the political activity in general as a collective space where we pause to listen and rethink these choices. But many colleagues have rarely experienced political activity, and they just perceive themselves as someone who is acted upon by systems of power rather than as an individual capable of producing some change, such as, for example, as we were talking about, collectively improving working conditions and wages. So for me, a primary issue concerns the difficulty of fostering a climate of free and supportive discussions among among colleagues. And a second issue, I think, involves the boundary between private time and work time. Work time understood as an activity tied to economic profit. Many factors tend to break down every barrier. Workers are constantly connected, always available, and continually urged to, let's say, achieve the result instead of counting the hours they worked, and thus subordinating intimate needs and desires to this relentless rhythm of work demands. And I think that the absence of a supportive climate and the dimension of total availability are interconnected problems. And maybe to address them, we need to free up some space in our lives and start to structure our agendas from our needs and build some political experience through the time of like mutual encounter and recognition.
So you spoke a bit about political activity there and the way that we engage at a political level. I wonder if you can talk about some of the ways that you're interacting with traditional institutions that represent or govern our profession, such as professional organizations, or even the Venice Biennale, which this interview is being recorded for.
Yeah. First of all, let me say that in Italy, we have a peculiar situation because over the past 25 years, the number of architects has jumped from just like 90,000 to nearly 160,000. So currently, about 3 out of 10 of us have salaried employment, while the rest, 7 out of 10, are, let's say, self-employed. But among these ones, uh, some few run their own firms, but many others, the majority, are precariously employed in firms and in design companies. And in certain districts, like the Milan metropolitan area, you can find clusters of companies with hundreds of precarious collaborators, as well as hundreds of studios working as their consultants. So this is an important premise to like frame our context in Italy. Meanwhile, from 2010 to 2020, more or less, enrollments in architecture faculties halved. And this is due to a combination of factors, I think: demographic decline, the shrinking middle class able to support children through studies, some sector-specific crises, and the emergence of various other interior design faculties and private schools, which are not, let's say, they don't allow you to subscribe to the Guild of Architects. So these figures uh, point to a technical and productive sector that is undergoing a profound transformation. I think what we have seen in the institutions representing and governing this profession is a lack of courage in like addressing and trying to regulate these changes. They have started talking about job insecurity, but they almost scientifically avoid taking simple but essential measures, like proposing a national work contract that sets minimum hourly wages, especially for young people who is starting, or at least publishing suggested hourly rates, as is done in other countries. Uh, and in universities, the subject of work of organization, both in practices and on the construction sites, remains a neglected topic. We don't talk about this. I think the Biennale has certainly shown openness to socially crucial themes like the right to housing, ecology, global inequalities. However, there's still very little space dedicated to internal state of the profession, as you are doing with these interviews. Um, and as ULLARC, as our collective, we firmly believe that there's no sustainability where labor is not fair. So you cannot talk about sustainability where working conditions are not fair.
Absolutely. I've always seen sustainability as a very human-centered concept that the planet's going to be just fine without us. And sustainability is really just about keeping us going. But you spoke a bit about the school or the university, the academic as like almost like an assembly line for the labor of capital, right? To produce capital. And I think we're continuing to see that. So same question to you, Carlotta. How are you interacting with the institutions that surround our profession?
But we as ULLARC, we believe it is essential to engage in dialogue with a diverse range of stakeholders, so not only studio collaborators, but also firm owners and public institutions and cultural organizations, because we think a broad and structured discussion is the foundation for generating profound and effective change. In particular with education, I think it's very important to rethink some aspect of it, because often it is within this sphere that those entering the field of architecture encounter the first major challenges, as I said before. So it is a work culture conveyed that neglects physiological and physical well-being, that is driven by pressing deadline that leaves students little room to cultivate interests outside the academic sphere. This educational model, I think, ultimately fosters self-devaluation and undermines confidence in responsibilities. And moreover, universities themselves often serve as precarious and fragmented workplaces where even those who teach or support academic activities find themselves in undervalued position. As for professional associations, we engage with a bit, in particularly with the National Council. I think a stronger commitment is needed on crucial issues such as fair wages and workplace safety and mental health for professionals in the field. So far, the few attempts made have failed to properly address the urgent transformation that the profession is undergoing. I lived in Venice for many years, and I regularly attend the Architecture Biennale. I think recent editions have shown a growing focus on social and environmental and political issues, as Mauro said. But despite some signs of openness, I think of, for example, at the Czech Republic Pavilion at the 2023 Biennale, which presented the Office of a Non-Precarious Future, a project that was directly addressing the working condition of young architects in the country. And also we as ULLARC, we have been invited last year by the curators of the Italian Pavilion to participate to the public program that was called Mondo Novo. in a talk with a representative of the National Council, but the Biennale has yet to systematically tackle the issue of workers' rights. So traditional institutions that represent and govern the architectural profession play a key role in shaping the discipline. And I think they do not merely influence the theoretical discourse, but they also directly impact working condition and industry regulation. So now more than ever, this institution must adapt to respond to the profound social, environmental, and labor transformation redefining architecture and its role in society.
Great. Love it. So Carlotta, I'll move on to the next one. What is your vision for the future of architecture?
Well, I think the future of architecture must prioritize sustainability, equity, and human well-being, redefining the profession as an active force for social and environmental profession. I personally envision an architecture deeply connected to social responsibility. This means fair labor practices, so a profession where architects are fairly compensated, protected, valued, and free from exploitation and burnout. It means accessible design, so inclusive and equitable spaces designed to serve diverse communities rather than catering to a privileged few. And also it means collaborative processes moving beyond the, let's say, star architect model towards collective and participatory design, where architects actually work closely with communities to create truly meaningful spaces. So the way architecture is practiced and recognized, I think, must change. It can no longer be limited to expensive commissions or market-driven projects, but it must be recognized as an essential public service. Actually, architects must actively engage in urban and territorial policies, addressing critical issues such as housing accessibility and climate resilience. So let's say I dream of a future where architects are not just building designers, but caretakers of the environment, defenders of the justice, and catalysts for collective progress. So I try to drive my work with this vision that pushing me to challenge outdated system and collaborate between different disciplines and promote architecture as a true agent of change.
Great. And Mauro, same question. What's your vision for the future of our profession?
Taking a look to the present situation, I think that the capitalist development has enabled a huge acceleration in construction times and also an exponential growth in the built environment. And like many other productive sectors, the construction industry has entered a cycle of waste and overproduction. In many areas, construction continues to build at a rapid pace, even where empty and abandoned buildings abound. And often materials whose end-of-life recycling and reuse capacity is unknown are used for this development, such as petroleum derivatives, glues, concrete, etc. And the overproduction and waste are also made possible by the dynamics of exploitation and production pressure that we were talking about before, both in design firms and especially on construction sites. I think that construction sites are often opaque places where regular workers mix with those without rights, without residence permits, without contracts. So construction sites are frequently places of abuse and blackmail, with a very low level of safety and the imposition of rhythms and organization that put workers in a systemic condition of danger. So my vision for the future of architecture, like Carlotta's one, places the well-being of workers at the center, both on the construction site and in the studio. And I also hope for a closer connection between the design and the construction phases, so that on one hand, the design can be not only a prefiguration of a form, but also an imagination of a way of building that is sustainable for those on the construction site, in the factories, in the workshops, etc. And on the other hand, that those who work in construction are made participant in the design idea that is being pursued and can provide useful indications for its best realization.
Like that idea that we're all in this together.
Yeah.
And Mauro, what advice do you have for people who are wanting to do organizing? Get into some of the things that you've been involved in.
Yeah, starting from our experience as ULLARC in these first 2 years of activity, perhaps the most challenging aspect for our group has been building and solidifying direct participation. Brazilian poet Vinicius de Moraes sang that life is the art of encounter, and that's very true, I think, both in everyday life and in political activity. At times we've become too focused on like crafting communication formulas, refining texts and programs, enriching our website, or in internal discussions, and we have lost sight of encounter as the essential and central source in the evolution of thought and political action. So encountering means going out in the territory, listening to people's stories, and being able to establish a connection, an empathetic connection with them that goes beyond mere verbal exchange. And even though Italy isn't a vast country compared to the States, for example, it's certainly very diverse in in its geographical, demographic, and economic makeup. And this complexity makes for us the presence on the territories even more urgent. So the advice I'd give is to start by organizing meetings, not just virtual ones, but in-person meetings, and keep the agenda of these meetings lively and diversified so that we can redefine and update our political action through this continuous engagement with reality and with people. So I think that encounter is the testing ground for political thought, just as construction is for design in the architecture field.
Really love that answer. And same for you, Carlotta. What advice do you have for folks wanting to do organizing?
But actually, the first and most honest piece of advice is simply to start. At the beginning of our journey, we felt the pressure to measure up as we needed to be incredibly well prepared on all the complex topics that this reflection touches upon. Over time, however, we realized something fundamental, but has the greatest impact, no matter how simple it may seem, it's the lack of dialogue and solidarity among colleagues. So creating spaces for discussion, listening, and mutual support is the first step toward real change, and this can actually be done every day, starting with the people at your own desk. So these spaces don't necessarily need to take the form of structure or official initiatives. Sometimes all it takes is an informal conversation over a coffee or a shared reflection at the end of the day to spark greater awareness. So change begins with small actions in recognizing common struggles and step by step building a support network that can evolve into a collective action. Often the fear of speaking up, the worry of not being knowledgeable enough hold us back from asking questions or raising concerns that in reality affect many of us. And we have internalized the idea that the problem is individual when in fact it is systematic. And it is precisely this fragmentation that makes change so difficult. However, I think when voices come together, the burden of the struggle is shared and making it more sustainable for everyone. Another crucial aspect is challenging the culture of sacrifice, because too often it is taken for granted that working architecture means accepting stress and precariousness and hyper-competitiveness But when we open up honest conversations, we realize that these issues are widespread and that the normalization of such dynamic is not inevitable. So questioning what seems unchangeable, I think, is the first step toward building alternatives. So starting to organize also means accepting uncertainty and the risk of making mistakes. There's no need for a definitive answer or a perfect strategy, but it is through the process of dialogue and collective action that new possibility emerge. And often what begins as a small act of solidarity becomes the spark for a much greater change that we could have ever imagined.
Wonderful. Well, Mauro and Carlotta, thank you so much for your time. I hope that we can meet and encounter in person sometime in the near future.
Yeah, thank you, Rand. I will wait for
Maybe in
you.
Venice.
Yeah.